Okay, 2026 rental reforms. How do England and Scotland compare in the rental reforms? This is the one we're going to talk about as well. We're going to talk about the Scottish Landlord Decision Chart, whether you should actually be staying, doubling down, or reviewing your position as a Scottish landlord with the new rental reforms, even coming in for Scotland themselves with the Housing Scotland Bill. So this is quite important, the difference between England and Scotland, and overall, who should be exiting the market, who should be staying, and who should be doubling down on what they're doing. Okay, the renters' right. Put my teeth back in. Karen, with the Renters' Right Act in England and the Housing Scotland Act 2025, both gaining Royal Assent, landlords face a series of 2026 rental reforms. In fact, to be honest, the scene is set for something of a Great Convergence between English and Scottish law as the new rules come into force. A lot of people actually, a lot of solicitors in England look at the Scottish law and think, yeah, it's pretty robust. It's actually quite good, especially when it comes to selling and buying houses as well. So we're kind of looked on, Scotland's kind of looked on with a wee bit of envy, so to speak, from the rest of the United Kingdom in terms of our housing law, because it is quite good for conveyancing and selling and buying and renting property as well. But they're more or less converging into each other. Whether you own a single rental home or a large portfolio over a wider area, the message is actually quite clear. Property management is about to get more hands-on than ever. I think that's something you maybe don't want to hear, Karen, when you think about it, because it's just, isn't it just more bureaucratic legislation to contend with?
It is, and I mean, it's something that we've been dealing with for years now. So for us, it's just second nature. We keep up to date with it. We roll with the changes. But for a lot of landlords, it's, well, as we can see, it's a full-time job. But Scotland is definitely ahead of the curve here a bit. So I think
isn't it? Yeah,
catching up
definitely.
with us.
I would say so, definitely. And with that in mind, we've created a guide on how England and Scotland compare with a closer look at the most notable factors, including things like periodic tenancies for everyone, rent offers and increases, and also controls. This is actually quite controversial because right now there's what would we call ambulance chasers in England, trying to work out how they can take advantage of the situation with things like Abb's Law, the October deadline coming in as well, and eviction tribunals, and also I think for what we would say, Karen, is, I mean, professionalism in this sector, in the private rented sector, it really isn't. There's no longer an option, is there?
No, it's going to become a must with the amount of legislation that we have in place and how much it's changing recently as well.
Yeah, definitely. So with that common thread on the 2026 rental reforms, and it's the rule book has been written for every landlord, let's explore these changes overall. I mean, what have we got to say about periodic tenancies, Karen?
So periodic tenancies are going to become for everyone. And I mean, in Scotland, we're very used to it. It's our day-to-day. But on the 1st of May 2026, a big bang will make sure the assured housing tenancies in England are covered by a rolling periodic system. So that's something that businesses in Scotland have had since 2017. So as I've said, we're quite ahead of the curve here already with it. This is something we've been practiced in place for years now, but it's going to be a bit of a change for the English system. So some of the key details that we have here are, despite the initial fears of higher tenancy turnovers, terms have actually increased in Scotland from 28 months to 3.5 years. So we see the benefit that it has had up here. And it does prove that tenants don't have a desire to consistently move home as well.
What do you think's driven that? Do you think it's a lot to do as well of the fact that rents are maybe going up a lot more than before? So people are actually seeing the opportunity of staying where they are as a huge benefit in terms of, well, my rent's actually okay, but moving to another property is significantly higher for the same type of property. Do you think that drives it as well?
It does, definitely. I mean, landlords are obviously having to maximise on the rents because they're aware of the change in legislation that's coming in, mortgage rates. There's various factors that all come into it, even things like home improvements as well, repairs, cost of contractors. So they are having to be a lot more conscious about the rent levels for it. So if a tenant's on a rent that's maybe not been increased in the last sort of couple of years, and they're at quite a stable rent. And there's a lot of cost involved in moving as well. So if they can stay, there is more option for it. And the fact that they have the flexibility as well makes them probably, I think it makes you think that you have the peace of mind of knowing you don't have to move. You can, but if the time comes, all you have to do is give 28 days notice and you can move on as a tenant.
There's also the concept behind this as well, is the fact that the landlord and the tenant know each other quite well, and therefore most landlords that have tenants in situ tend to give a lesser rent than the market rent. I mean, there's no. I don't hide anything when I say that, myself, we're 35% below inflation in terms of our rental increases. So we're still 35% below where it should have been if inflation was applied to our rents in the very beginning over all the years.
And as a landlord as well, you want to be, if you have a good tenant in place, you don't want to be losing them. If you've got somebody that's been paying the rent consistently, been looking after the property, for the sake of a rent increase that might push the boat too far and to a point that they can't afford it, you're then going to have the cost incurred of remarketing the property and finding a new tenant. So you need to weigh up your options here when reviewing the rents. And that's something that we take into consideration when we're reviewing the rents for all of our properties.
So when you look at the notice periods then in Scotland and England, how does that compare then? I mean, the notice periods, what are they in Scotland just now?
So in Scotland, in the initial 6 months, it is 28 days to be provided by both the landlord and the tenant. After that 6-month period, the 28 days remains in place for a tenant. However, a landlord has to issue 84 days notice to the tenant if they want the property back, and they have to have grounds to do so. So obviously we'll cover throughout this, but no fault evictions are not a thing. So you have to have a ground to be able to serve notice on a tenant.
Yeah, I'm amazed at how many times private landlords still think that they've got the right just to end the tenancy. I've had it recently from someone, actually not associated with us, but just on an advisory basis, saying the landlord sent them notice straight away, and they basically walked into the house as well and actually inspected the house without giving them notice at all. And this was actually quite local in terms of our market, in terms of our house market. And I was quite appalled by that. That's someone has no idea what they're talking about. So how does it compare then for the notice period and stuff like that for England then?
So England is quite different just now. So they can serve, a tenant can serve 2 months notice at any time. So a bit like what we used to be on our short assured tenancies.
Yeah.
But a landlord must give 4 months notice, and only after 8 months because of the 1 year protected tenancy period.
Yeah, okay, that's quite encumbrant, isn't it?
Yes. So again, it'll probably actually benefit the system and give it a bit more flexibility in England when they are more on kind of the same regulations that we're on here. I found there's been such a change between the short assured to the private residential tenancies, and it makes the exit process a lot smoother now, because prior to this, tenants had to give 2 months notice from the tenancy start date. So you could be talking in excess of 2 months notice period, and it was very hard for factoring in the relet process because it's such a long period. Whereas now, because it's 28 days, it makes things a lot easier to do that transition between properties, factor in the vacant periods and factor in a new tenancy as well. So there's definitely been some pros to it there just for that side alone.
So when you talk about the grounds and the statutory grounds that people can actually end the tenancy on, one of the ones that are quite controversial is when maybe the landlord wants the property back to either renovate, to sell, or move back into. Is there kind of restrictions when they try to do that? Is there some moratorium on a certain period of time or anything like that? If a landlord tries to do that, maybe being opportunistic to think they can get the tenant out in an easier way, is there some sort of restrictions to that?
Yes, so if a landlord does that, there is a protected point in Scotland where basically, so if a landlord serves notice to renovate, sell or move back in, they are blocked from reletting the property from a year. So so there's a slight difference here still between Scotland and England. So when the notice is served, this is from when the notice is served in Scotland, so that's when that block starts. Whereas in England, it's when the notice expires. So again, there's still a bit of a difference there in between the two countries.
So then this is to stop them then easily just trying to put someone out and then suddenly putting the rent up and letting it 2 weeks later.
Yes, and in Scotland we have, obviously there's strict regulations about it. So if you are caught out for doing an unlawful eviction, which is basically you, for example, serve notice on the property to the tenant that you're going to be selling it, you don't sell it, you decide to relet it instead, and it's not within that, and it's within that year period, you could face very hefty fines if this does get brought forward that you've been caught out doing an unlawful eviction. So if you're serving notice as a landlord, you have to make sure your ground is valid and is implemented as well.
So when we come to things as well, other couple of grounds in here that are quite controversial is antisocial or criminal behaviour. Is there any fast tracks to serve notice on these two things?
So antisocial behaviour is one of the hardest grounds to serve notice on, because you have to have all the evidence to do so. So I'm talking crime reference numbers, neighbour reports, contacts from the council. It is one of the hardest ones to do. However, if you do have all your documentation and evidence there, for an antisocial or criminal behaviour, landlords can serve 28 days notice at any point in Scotland and in England. But in England, landlords will be able to commence the proceedings immediately. So here we still have that shortened 28-day period for it, but in England it can be done with immediate effect.
It's still quite difficult, isn't it? Because we've had this recently, about 6 months ago, where we finally evicted someone on antisocial behaviour in one of our properties, one of my properties actually. And even though we clearly proved that, the tribunal even pushed it back, didn't they?
They did. So it was a rather problematic tenant that we did not put in, came to us with the tenant in place. But
basically inherited them, didn't we, when it was a
Yes.
portfolio I bought, and we never knew this tenant was like this. And then we inherited that tenant, and then we spent best part of a year and a half trying to get this person out. And on several occasions, the first tribunal was actually pushing back all the time, even though we had clearly had specific evidence. And it just, dare I say, it was kind of trying to make things up, excuses about how not to grant this eviction.
It was, and I'd say the saving grace, it wasn't really, but the tenants had issues with rent arrears. So again, that worked in our favour for the eviction, because obviously we had multiple grounds on this tenancy because it was quite problematic, and the poor neighbours at this one as well. So thankfully it's all turned around now, and we have nice tenants in that do not cause neighbour issues and pay the rent on time.
Thank goodness for that. But anybody that's wanting any information on tenancies, then you can download model tenancy agreements actually from the Scottish Government's website, and periodic tenancy templates for England will be available on the UK gov.uk website from March this year. So that's advice. Also, you've got your local landlord associations, which you could actually join. I would wholly endorse joining a landlord association, because we need a voice in the private rented sector to talk on our behalf. And the more people that get behind the organisation, for example, the Scottish Landlord Association, SAL, and in England, it's the National Residential Federation of Landlords, who used to be the NLA, the National Landlord Association, and the Residential Landlord Association merged together to have this function. And they have what I would call clout as well. Because as a singular voice, as a singular landlord by myself, what chances do you think I've got of changing the government's opinion or government minister's opinion if I'm trying to do it just by myself? This is why it's so important, I think, that most landlords, or every landlord, gets behind these landlord associations, irrespective of your views about whether they do a right job or a wrong job. They're there to represent us, and the governments will listen to them, and more than likely listen to them only. So we need them on our side. Plus the fact, if you remember, you also have a voice within that organisation. I think that's so important as well.
Even for a point of contact as well, if you have, every day is a learning day, and no matter how long 10 years I've been doing this about now, and there's still new things that you come across. And if you're not sure, there's a point of contact there that you can get some reassurance with if you do have any questions about the rogue things that come up that are not your everyday problems. So it's just good to have that extra bit of reassurance there, as well as...
I do every time. On the landlord forums, Karen, you've got loads and loads of people: Scottish Landlord Association, Scottish Property Network, and the Scottish Property Investors Network, and landlord tax as well. Every single time someone comes on for advice, and I think the Landlord Associations could actually give them the right advice, I tell them every single time, if you remember a landlord association, one of these landlord associations, just go and ask them. Facebook is great for opinions, but sometimes some people do not deliver the right opinions or the right facts on what should be done. It's quite frightening when you think about it, and yet these landlord associations are there for a fraction of the cost. I mean, what, just over 100 quid? Tax deductible as well, so if you're a 40% payer, it's 60 quid to you really in real terms. And you've got instant advice just like that, and it saves you an absolute fortune. You could over get a good mortgage as well through it. You could possibly get good legal representation through it as well if you need it. And you can actually get access to discounts. I think it's B&Q and various other organisations as well, just because you're a landlord association member. So I think it's well worth it. It pays for itself.
Yeah, I love my
going on this one is, yeah, definitely. Well, we've used it loads and loads of times. We're a corporate member, great. And I'm also a personal member of them as well through my companies. One of the most controversial areas for me is the rent officers and the increases and the controls that are putting down. Could you elaborate on what's happening in England and also in what's happening in Scotland at this point in time?
Yeah, so this is where we differentiate the most between Scotland and England in our 2026 rental reforms. So there's a rundown of things that are going to look north and south of the border. We're still quite different here. So landlords have been required to give 3 months notice of rent reviews in Scotland since 2017. So again, we've been quite ahead of the curve here. Legislation's been up to date since then. However, in England, the current 1 month requirement will increase to 2 months from the 1st of May. So tenants are getting a bit more of a heads up about it, which in the current climate is quite fair. Obviously, it can be a big financial change for somebody, especially if you've got a landlord that's doing quite a substantial rent increase. It's good that tenants can get the notice for it and obviously make arrangements going forward. So as I say, Scotland, 3 months notice. England is going to be increasing to 2 months notice with their new legislation.
Now that's every 12 months, isn't it? And you can do that at the very minimum. So what would you advise people out there to do then? To write to them like
So in Scotland, there is an official document that you're meant to issue your tenant. You cannot just go to their, I mean, you could go and have a chat with them in the first place, just obviously so they know it's coming, maybe discuss what's going to be financially suitable for them and work for yourself as well. But there is official documentation that you have to provide to a tenant. It has to be done in writing. They have to get the right paperwork. If you're a landlord that's just maybe a bit more old school and just goes and has a chat with them, if there's any comeback on that, you don't have a leg to stand on because you've not issued the correct paperwork for it. And in line with the Scottish system, rent increases in England will also be limited to 1 a year as well. So the tenants will be able to change them during which they cannot. So basically within that year period, you can't raise the rent. If you've issued a rent increase in January, your next rent increase cannot come in play till the next January there.
So would it be best to write out to the tenant maybe 2 months before the end, before the 12 months, so at month 10 or month 9 or something like that? If you've got 3 months, could you write to the tenant in month 9 saying the rent's going to go up at the first point in the end of month 12?
You can. So if you are looking to issue it, so for example, we'll stick with the January. So if you're issuing it in January, you can notify them 3 months prior to that. So it might seem like you're doing this quite a lot, but it's giving the tenant the required notice. So if it comes into effect each year, at that 9 month point is when you can be reissuing the new notice. So you might even want to mark it in your calendar for 3 months and maybe a couple of weeks prior to that as well, just so you've got that extra heads up to kind of get your ducks in a row, have a look at the finances and start making plans in place for the new 3 month notice point.
Yeah. But you don't, I mean, I'll point out, just in case anybody doesn't understand this, you don't need to increase the rent if you don't want to. If you think it's okay, your rent level that you're getting, and you think you'll be able to make the return that you need to get, and you think you'll be able to do the repairs and improvements for the future that you need to do to your property, because you will have ongoing repairs and improvements over time, then by all means, don't increase the rent if you don't think that's the case. But sometimes you might have to. If you're in a rent pressured status area, because it might get with rent controls eventually when they're in, the local authority declares that there's a rent pressured area and therefore you're restricted in the amount of increase you can get, woe betide if the inflation and all the cost of everything goes up, and the cost of your mortgage maybe goes up as well if you're financing it, as most landlords possibly do, then you're going to leave yourself over a barrel if you're keeping your rent historically low, just in case. There's always an option as well, as you put the rent up and then you give the tenant a rebate over a period of time. So you could possibly give them a rent reduction, or later on you can give them a rebate back, or you could possibly just get the rent at that level. So it's important to understand the dynamics. Because after all, I know most landlords don't realise, but you're actually running a business here. And you're in the business of not renting houses. You're in the people business of looking after people and their tenancies and making sure you have you're kept to your responsibilities as a duty of care towards your tenants. That's the most important thing possible. And we will talk about that with Ab's Law coming in, what that will make, because it's going to come in Scotland and England. What other things have we got to think about then when we come to rents and stuff like that? As I said, I touched on the subject of there seems to be this ambulance chaser thing coming on, and I could see online about people arguing about the fact that you can challenge your rent now and you can get it back. So are landlords in England, will they be able to accept offers higher than advertised prices? Is that possible?
So one of the differences that they're going to be coming in is landlords in England will not be able to accept offers higher than the advertised price. So this doesn't apply in Scotland yet, but they are considering adapting that system in place in Scotland. Now, for us, it does happen now and again, but if you're putting the property on at the right value in the first place, your main objective should be trying to find yourself the right tenant. If you've got maybe a couple of people that's really hard to pick from, that might be an extra £20 a month, could be the differentiating factor there for it. However, in England, landlords don't have that option anymore.
Yeah, definitely. And then we had talked about the things that your rent increases in England will be limited to once a year, as in line with the Scottish system as well. What about local authorities in Scotland? When they designate rent control areas, which they will, remember it's not the Scottish government that's going to do it. The local authority has to apply to the Scottish government to do that. And if the Scottish government says, yeah, that's fine, they can designate rent control areas. What will that rise be restricted to? Is there a restriction, or is it just a certain amount they're getting, or how's that formula worked?
Yeah, so controlled areas, if applied, will have an annual increase restricted to a CPI of plus 1% and capped at 6%. So this is why it's really
price index,
So this is why it's really conscious to be mindful of what rent increases that you are doing, because if you do put it too high, the tenant disputes it and takes it to a rent assessment officer. This is something that's going to get factored into these rent control areas. If we have one area, for example, in Fife, if there are that many rent disputes basically about the increases going to the rent officers, they will flag it up as an issue, and that's another factor in which rent controls could then be implemented.
This is quite interesting, because exactly today I got two messages, one from Vodafone which says we'll do CPI plus 3.9, that your prices are going up from April. Sorry? I thought prices go up by inflation. That's what CPI is. So surely if I'm just getting an inflationary increase in your bills, then that's covering your costs. No, they've decided to add 3.9% above that. And the same is applied for Virgin Media as well. So they're allowed to do that, and yet landlords are actually restricted to 1%. That's it. And a maximum of 6%. And yet everybody else is allowed to do everything differently.
It kind of takes us back a bit to like COVID restrictions as well, because that was the situation we were in there. You were a maximum of 3% unless you could prove financial hardship, then it was 6%. So it does put a big restrictive covenant on landlords. And again, that's the things that can push landlords out the market if you've not been prepared in the first place, and that you're then at this financial loss because these restrictions are on you and you can't put your rent up. So I would always advise doing small incremental increases over time. Even if it's like an extra £20-30 a year on your tenant, it will just slowly bring it up, as opposed to you get into a point and you realise it's been years and then you're having to do a big increase for it, and then the tenant's struggling and you're in a position that's not exactly ideal.
You actually think you're doing your tenant a favour, actually, not increasing them every year, but you're actually doing them an injustice, especially if you've got a long-term tenant, because you will have that big jump, won't you?
You will, yeah. And it's best tip that we can give is, if you haven't raised the rent for years, avoid the big jumps. As a tribunal may force you to keep the rent as it is. As we've said, tenants can take it to the rent assessment officer and they could just say, we actually had one of them that the tenant did dispute it, and we were able to provide comparisons to justify the rent increase, and the rent officer still said no.
So that's amazing. That still happens. The rent officer's still denying and actually saying that, even though we've clearly got the evidence. Is there any comeback on that, or is it just rent officer's decisions final?
There's not. You can take it to tribunal, but that's your only other option. So if a rent officer says no, your only other option is to take it forward to a tribunal, which again, I mean, we've got an insight as to how long these things are taken at tribunal at the best of times. So if you've got that, you could be waiting a year for a decision.
And then you've got
on
the
it,
cost
basically.
of taking it to a tribunal in terms of the time, and also in terms of if you need to get someone else to do it for you. So it's hardly going to justify it, unless it's a huge amount in terms of your rent increase. That's the only reason it would make it cost effective, if that makes sense.
It is, yeah, and you have to. It is being so conscious of what you're doing here, and as I say, it's a full-time job for us for a reason, because there is so much detail that goes into it, and making sure that, as I say, you have to make sure you've got all the paperwork in place, so professionally presented and data-led and reasonable annual reviews are what are going to keep you backed up here, is all your evidence.
Definitely.
And it'll get you the most consistent outcome for an improvement on the rent without any conflict between your tenant and obviously yourself.
I think that's the key here, is to avoid the conflict. It's actually to be open and upfront and be nice about it, rather than actually just being quite draconian about the whole thing. Sending somebody a letter and saying that's the end of it without any discussion. I think that then sets the tone and makes it so difficult to actually to communicate between your tenant and the landlord as well, or even the letting agent.
And I mean, we've had some tenants that have, we've got quite a lot that are in receipt of universal credit. So we've had quite a few that obviously the universal credit payments increased within the last year or so now. Lose track of how quickly time goes, but we've been bringing our tenants up to line with what they're entitled to. So there's been a lot of them that we've just had that conversation with to say, look, we're putting up your rent to this, but this is why, because it's what you're entitled to. And the odd ones come back and they've not been able to get the full entitlement from universal credit. And we're like, well, that's fine. We'll set it to what you are entitled to then. So it's having that come and go in that communication with your tenant to make sure things go nice and smoothly as possible.
So this then takes me on to this. I touched on it previously about Abb's law, and what we call the October deadline coming up. What is Abb's law? And does it apply to all landlords across the UK, and how could we deal with it as private landlords? How do we deal with it?
So this is set to come into full force across the whole of the UK in October 2026. So this is dealing with hazards such as damp and mold. Obviously, if you're seeing anything to do with property, you know how much of an issue it can be across the whole of the UK.
Yeah.
We have to live in a very humid climate, so we do have real issues with it. So, and it is among one of the most unforgiving pieces of legislation that we've seen as well. So it is a very strict one. There are very strict guidelines set out, so I'm going to cover them all as well. So given that rental homes need to be wind and watertight, obviously that's our Repair and Standard Act that we have here in Scotland, you need to also ensure your tenant understands the importance of ventilating the property. And not only that, but that they actually do it as well.
It's the biggest piece of controversy between tenant and landlord, isn't it?
Yes.
It's the most conflict it causes, because landlords don't realise they have to educate their tenants. They make assumptions straight away, or they walk in the door to do an inspection and they see something getting dried in the house, or maybe the windows aren't open and the shower's been on or something like that, and they immediately make this carte blanche decision about how the tenant's living in the property. Is it worth actually getting a professional in to actually, and who would you contact for that?
Yes. So if you're having issues, if it is not obvious that what the issue is, I mean, it's this week alone, I've had to educate 2 tenants on mold build-up in the property. And one of the key things I would say is keep a bottle of mold and mildew spray with you when you're going out, if you're doing inspections. I keep a bottle in the car. A lot of it is education there. But if you do have a tenant that's digging in their heels and making things quite problematic for yourself and identifying the issues of it and keeping on top of the property, companies such as a preservation company would be the best person to send in. They will do a full assessment of the building itself, inside and out, and establish what the cause is. So quite a lot of the time, if it's black spot mold, it's just caused by condensation. That is the tenant's responsibility to make sure that they're ventilating the property. If black spot mold does occur, clean it down. It's not going to go away on its own. It will just spread. So making sure that that is relayed to the tenant. And they actually, the good thing about, we use the preservation company to go out and do reports. They actually give us a condensation leaflet. So if we have a tenant that's experiencing problems with it, that is provided to them, as well as us discussing with them what they need to be doing to ventilate the property better. So there's no excuse, they have all the information that they need.
It's independently verified then, isn't it, by a professional? It knows what they're doing. I mean, I've seen it so many times over the last 30 years, especially with being involved with the Landlord Association and being on their advice line at one point in time. But I've seen it so many times where the landlord just tells the tenant what they should be doing, or assumes that they should be doing something, and they leave the tenant to get on with it. But then they've got no proof about they've actually told them. I mean, when it comes to a conflict, I mean, if you end up at a tribunal with a tenant and a landlord, if you've got no evidence to say that you've actually told your tenant this, and you've got an assessment on this by a professional organisation with their qualifications in this field, to say that it is the tenant's use of the property that's caused this problem, condensation, build up and stuff like that, and no lack of ventilation, then you've not got a leg to stand on, have you?
Exactly. And the good thing with us doing inspections of the property, if this is something that's discussed, it is documented in the report, and that's then got a date on it. There's clear written evidence as to what's been discussed, when it was discussed. And if the tenant's not followed up on that, then we can pass the liability to them. Obviously, making sure you're doing regular inspections is key here, because have they taken on board what you've said? And as I say, I take the mold spray in with me and I show them just how easy it is to get rid of it. And it's them, they have to keep up with it. And I've actually had tenants being like writing down what brand of mold and mildew spray that I've taken out with me, because it's one of the good ones you don't have to wipe down. So it's not affecting the paint bin.
So when you get someone reporting this, is there a timeline how you should deal with this?
Yeah, so there's quite a few time restrictions that are going to apply under this legislation here. So when a hazard such as mold or damp is reported, the landlords have 10 working days to investigate the problem. You then have 3 working days to provide a written summary of the findings to your tenant, and 5 days to begin the repairs. So again, if it's condensation, there are still measures a landlord can take if there are issues with condensation build up in the property, making sure, for example, if it's building up in a cupboard, putting vents in the cupboard door so it's still getting circulation going through. If it's in a porch area, we have an area in Methil, they've got the original bits by the door. A lot of them have been boarded, have had external UPVC doors put into them. They were not designed to be kept like that. And the amount of them that have issues with condensation in them, near enough all of them, basically. So again, educating landlords as to maybe the steps that can be taken there to prevent, so the property still getting ventilated as well. And then obviously the tenant has to do their due diligence in with it.
This is a lot to do with the legislation on insulation and stuff like that as well, isn't it? And all the free insulation measures that everybody's got. We've literally just closed off every draft in a house. And that's really what used to keep most houses ventilated, was the drafts that came up through the floorboards, that came through the vent on the outside, the brick vents. All these different things used to come in. And maybe you had, I mean, I'm not saying you need single glazed windows again, but you had single glazed windows with a sashing case. So there was always a sort of draft blowing in. And while we didn't want these drafts, that's kind of what kept us all at bay, isn't it?
It is, and that's the thing. It's the lack of ventilation that buildings now have, or that tenants prevent them from having, is what causes a lot of the issues that we find. And again, we get high moisture areas such as bathrooms, kitchens. Like your bathroom's the worst one for it.
All the time, isn't it?
I don't think people realise as well how much moisture their body produces when they're sleeping. Bedrooms are another one that's really bad for it as well. So, but yeah, I was at one yesterday actually, an inspection, and the tenant's running a wee dehumidifier in the kitchen, just because it is an older building. It's sash and case windows. So again, it's prone to build up of condensation with the heat from inside meeting outside, and but he's taken the steps needed, which is great to see.
Now, what happens though if you've got a difficult tenant that doesn't give you access? What can you do? What should a landlord, a private landlord, do?
So you need time-stamped logs and your attempts to enter. So making sure, again, documentation is going to be your key here, because you could end up being held liable for damages that can run into the thousands. So again, making sure you've got a paper trail of when you've tried to gain access. It's all time and date stamped. If you have any communication from the tenant with them being difficult with it, make a note of that as well, so you have a record of it all if this does come round. Because the best practice in here is to conduct regular inspections, maintain your property correctly and get your tenants' initials next to a clause around damp and mould to prevent it in the tenancy agreement as well.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing. It is about having a proper audit trail, isn't it? It's especially with like what I said about you've got the so-called ambulance chasers now looking at opportunity for this, the solicitors and the lawyers, and thinking to ourselves, if we can find somebody that's got a problem with mold or damp or anything like that, then potentially we could use the legislation to claim money off of them. That seems to be what's going to happen, or what they're trying to instigate. And it's probably like what you said, why regular inspections get their initials next to these inspections to say that you've actually done it, rather than just a bit of paper saying, well, I inspected it. Well, how do you know if this is true, or you've not just made this up? And actually getting the professionals out and having that correct audit trail, I think that is so important, isn't it?
It is, because you can get tenants that will dispute things till they're black and blue in the face. So unless you've got, sometimes you do need that professional opinion and that third party opinion as well, just to be like, no, this is the cause of it. And there is a difference between damp and mold. Obviously, you can get it building up because of condensation, but there can be other issues such as obviously rising damp, roofs leaking. So things like this, it is down to the landlord to make sure, well, firstly to the tenant to let the landlord know, but they don't always. So again, coming back to your inspections, but that is down to the landlord to make sure the necessary repairs are being carried out to their property to prevent any further damage, because if they're not nipped in the bud, water will just continue to come in, especially in Scotland. It rains a lot. So making sure that you're keeping on top of any maintenance aspects. It's grey right now. It's always grey.
4 seasons in one day.
Oh, I know.
And I think that is such an important thing about this. So, damp and mold is going to be a thing of, it's going to be focused on quite heavily over the next couple of years. So I think for most landlords, please take time to make sure you get this all done correctly. This then brings me to one of the most controversial ones ever. No one, a letting agent, a private landlord, the last resort is always evictions. No one wants to evict. I mean, let's be honest. No one wants to evict a tenant that's paying their rent, and evict a tenant that's looking after their property, and evict a tenant that's not antisocial towards their neighbours. Nobody wants to evict anybody like that. So, there comes a time, though, as a last resort, and I've done it myself. I always say to you, when I've got my property you're running for me, is the last resort is always eviction. And that should never be the first resort to do anything. It's to resolve the situation first, try as much as possible, even involving mediation in that. But there comes a time where eviction has to happen. And with that coming removal of Section 21 no-fault evictions in England, but we already have the Scottish systems had no-fault eviction removed anyway, and we're now on to what we call grounds-based evictions, which are no longer mandatory, I believe. They're all discretionary, where some used to be discretionary, some definitely used to be mandatory, but they're at discretion now, which means the tribunal could actually go one way or the other, depending on how they feel on the day, and how the evidence is presented to them in a good way. So what sort of advice would you give private landlords if they have to go down this route, and how the first stage tribunal works, maybe, how, what roughly costs involved and stuff like that? What would this kind of look like, roughly and loosely?
So we've got a few tips here, but my main one is make sure your paperwork is correct, because the tribunal will pick it apart, and any slight mistake, any slight error with it, your case is lost. And you could have been waiting at a minimum of 9 months for this hearing date. And if your paperwork is incorrect in the slightest way possible, you're back to square one, having to reissue it and go through this whole process again. And if you're maybe claiming for an eviction for rent arrears, you could be out of pocket for a lot of rent here. So making sure that your paperwork is correct is my first tip. But there's a few different wee ones that we've got here. So the first year tribunal in Scotland handles disputes for free, but it is overwhelmed just now. So as I've said, you could be waiting a minimum of 9 months for a hearing date, quite possibly even longer for it. And this is leading to significant delays when it comes to repossessions for the properties. So I believe they are meant to be doing a recruitment drive, which will hopefully speed up the process. But I think over COVID and the years coming out of it, we've got quite a backlog there as well. So, I mean, there's...
Then when you think about it, you're thinking about 9 months. I mean, you've even got the 3 months notice you've actually got to give. or the 2 months notice, or whatever it is you need to give under the legislation. So you've got that on top of it. So you're almost 12 months in before you even get a look in about a hearing at the actual first year tribunal. Is that correct?
Yeah, so if you're issuing on the grounds of rent arrears, a tenant has to be in 3 months of consistent rent arrears to be able to issue a notice, and it has to be a 28-day notice that they get. So this is obviously a lot longer process than when we were on short assured tenancies. It was 2 weeks notice that they used to get, and that was it. It was done and
so
out.
we're 3 months in, and then we've got 28 days notice, and then after 28 days notice, then we'll have to apply to the tribunal, don't we? And then that could take 9 months.
Minimum.
So basically, it could be the best part of 13 months before we actually even get the hearing out of rent, if it's rent arrears and they're not paying. So 13 months. How many landlords, when you think about it, can survive? Because most landlords in Scotland and England as well have 1 to 2 properties. Now, they're not running about in Porsches and Ferraris. They're just normal day-to-day people. They're maybe just wanting something on the side to make an income from them, to build up their pension for the future, and they're losing 13 months just like that. And then they've got costs on top of that for legal costs, because are they going to represent themselves? Personally, I don't think anybody should represent themselves unless you've got the specialist knowledge. You need to get a professional to do that for you. And it's like what you said, Karen, the paperwork has to be immaculate. All the dates, has to be precision. You can end up getting that thrown out. Once you get into 13 months later, you get it into the tribunal. After 13 months no rent, it gets thrown out, and you're back to the beginning. Another 12 months to go.
Yeah, and for what you would pay for the legal representation for it, it would be worth it rather than having to restart the whole process again. Just make sure it's done right in the first place.
What does that compare? I mean, you're saying, we do say the tribunal in Scotland handles it for free, but the reality is it's no really, because you've got to pay a solicitor or representation if you don't really have the knowledge. I think that's definitely what you should be doing, but it's entirely up to yourself whether you try it yourself. But in England, first year tribunal, it does actually require fees, about £110 for initiating proceedings. It's a further £227 for the actual hearings, but the government is hoping to digitise the system and possibly follow a line along the same lines as what Scotland is. What happens about your tenant if they fail to leave after possession?
So if your tenant fails to leave, it's then a case of having to order a sheriff officer to come and issue the eviction. So that's based in Scotland. If you are in England, you have the county court bailiffs to issue the eviction. So again, when the notice is, you've gone through this whole tribunal process, you've got your order of eviction, you then have a 30-day appeal period, so that's an extra month on top of that. Then at the end of that, if your tenant's still not moved out, you then have to arrange the sheriff officers, which usually takes on average 2 to 3 weeks for that to then be implemented as well. So it's not even just a case of getting the order of possession, it's even the work that's required at the end of it as well. So it's a long process. Yeah,
definitely. And then when you think about it as well, it is, when you think about the amount of hassle and the amount of pressure it puts on even the landlord and I suppose even the tenant. I mean, I know the tenants, it might be the case that they just can't afford to pay the rent anymore because they maybe lost their job. Maybe local housing allowance, or what we used to call housing benefit, for the government assistance gives, isn't enough to keep up with the rent level, because they only give a certain amount for a certain number of people in a property. It doesn't follow the property, it follows the people. So if you've got 2 people in a property, it costs £1,500 a month. They're only entitled to a 1-bedroom allowance under the universal credit system, which is effectively £448 a month in Fife. So where are you going to get the other £1,000?
And obviously, as we say, this is hopefully a last resort. Like, there should be steps that can be taken to hopefully prevent it. But do you know what? Sometimes the situation does arise. You do have to serve notice on the grounds of arrears, or even, do you know what, landlords that are looking to sell and their tenants not moving out can still go through this process as well, or looking to move back in. This is not restricted to rent arrears. This is the general process for if a tenant has not vacated.
So do you think, especially rent arrears, do you think it's important that when you walk it all back, possibly the referencing procedure is actually followed correctly and how you should do that?
Definitely. And I mean, at the end of the day, nobody has a crystal ball. You're not going to have 100% certainty, but taking all the necessary steps in the first place to try and minimize your risk for a tenant is key here. So
Yeah.
making sure referencing is done correctly, credit checks are carried out, references are obtained, bank statements checked. There's loads of steps that you can take to hopefully prevent it. But as I say, nobody has a crystal ball, so you might end up in this situation one way or another.
Yeah, personally, I think that's why possibly the importance of maybe using a letting agent to do that, because they have a system. Most letting agents have systematized the whole thing where they could actually check all these things quite easily at a minimal cost. Whereas as a private individual landlord, it might actually be quite difficult to learn all that in the beginning, or actually find this proper systems that will do everything that a letting agent would do. Plus the fact that I feel that some tenants aren't going to be really good payers, will often shy away from letting agents for the fear of actually getting, because they know they'll get found out in the beginning in the referencing process.
Yeah, we're like little detectives.
Yeah, I think that is the case. I've seen the difference. I used to do it myself, and I used to do it. I obviously do it through you guys now, and I think I definitely see the difference. But then I kind of adopted the same principle like what we use where we are just now in Fife Properties, for that very reason. Because I wanted to make sure in the beginning that I was able to get the right people, and I was able to minimize the defaults as much as possible, because that is probably the most important. That's kind of the killer when it comes to being a private landlord, isn't it? As soon as you lose the rent, you've had it. You've got no income. You still got to pay a mortgage. You possibly have to pay repairs and improvements out of your own pocket because of that. And if you're 12 months down the line with no rent, it's like if the heating goes, you've got a duty of care and responsibility under the Standard Repairing Act to actually just sort that.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Even if your tenant's not been paying, as you say, you've still got to be making sure the property is maintained and adhering to all the Repair Act for it as well. So as frustrating as that can be.
And it's good to have a letting agent as well, because it takes away that conflict, especially in a situation like that, where maybe somebody isn't paying their rent according to what they should be doing, or in the way they should be doing it. And the conflict is there's kind of an in between, an arbitrary system, whereas you're not full on at each other. When the tenant phones up and suddenly says, look, I have to get my heating fixed, or I have to get my roof fixed, or I have to get, I have to get that window changed. And you're sitting saying to yourself, but if you're not paying any rent, how do you expect me to pay that? Because you still have to do it.
Mm-hmm. And again, just as a landlord, it can be really frustrating if you're the one getting the phone call or just the ignorance as well of a tenant not paying their rent. So it takes, obviously we're coming from it from a professional aspect, and we have procedures in place and steps that we take to try and obviously de-escalate the situation. And we had a landlord and they were just getting so irate with the situation, and understandably, but I was like, look, you need to step back and let me deal with it, because I was like, I know what we need to do here. And we got them out, and it was a smooth exit. And afterwards he's like, you're very good at de-escalating the situation. I was like, yes, I know, because I've had plenty of experience in it. But you have to just take a step back and let the professionals deal with it. So it's in your best interest to do so. You can go and be angry elsewhere about it, but you can't do it to the tenant, because it's just going to make the situation worse.
This is why professionalism is really no longer an option, isn't it? I mean, it's the biggest takeaway from the established rental reforms in Scotland, is that solo landlords face an uphill battle to actually keep pace. Those who stay or enter the sector are seeing the value of agents, and why would that be? In what areas would you think an agent would actually contribute to?
So in Scotland, agents must adhere to the mandatory letting agent code of practice and register with the Scottish letting agent register as well. So we're all doing things by the book. We're all registered. We're all compliant.
Well, you have to be qualified as well.
Yep. So
you have to be qualified through Letwell. There is another organisation that does it, Property Mark, I think it is. But you have to have a Letwell qualification, which is a proper qualification for letting agents, or you cannot let property in Scotland.
Yes, I remember doing it, and there's a lot of work that goes into it.
Yeah, we were one of the first, actually, I think.
I think I was, one of the first.
Hence the reason why the housing minister at the time took us aside and got an individual photograph with us for for being one of the first letting agents in Scotland to actually qualify under Letwell. The English agents are subject to strict rules that include belonging to approved schemes for redress or client money protection. But I don't think it's as encumbrant as what Scotland's like. And with our up-and-coming English private rented sector database, an enhanced Scottish landlord register as well available to the courts, the lack of basic adherence could see possession claims thrown out. That is the biggest worry, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. As I say, they will pick apart anything that they can.
And to a degree, unless being a landlord is your sole job and you really enjoy the minutiae of the management, it's very easy for compliance fatigue to really set in and become a time-consuming and taxing distraction. I think that's why a lot of single unit landlords have left the market since 2019, and they've been really put off, because in 2019, I think it was like, the statistic was something like 94% of landlords in Scotland had 1 or 2 properties. Now it's down at 76% of landlords in Scotland have 1 or 2 properties. The portfolio landlords have actually come into their fruition. The single unit landlords have actually slowed down as a result of it. I think that's the most important thing. And this is the one thing I want to talk about in terms of the decision chart. We'd actually said we'd talk about this, about the rental reforms and who should actually think about exiting the market, who should actually review their position in terms of being a Scottish landlord or a landlord in England as well, to be honest, because I think most will apply as well, or who should actually double down and think, yeah, okay, we're in it for the long term. We're going to be good at this. Here's the chart right here. And we'll let you see it. So here we are. This is the chart here. I'll just flick back here. Here we go. So those I recommend it should really possibly exit the market are the highly leveraged landlords, the ones that are way beyond 75% loan to value. They're on interest-only mortgages, and they've really got thin margins to operate on. If anything happens, if a rent restriction gets put in and your interest rates go up, you are in trouble. If the market drops in terms of the valuation of the property because we'll have a credit crunch or the banks or there's a correction in the market, your loan to value is no longer compliant with the bank, and therefore the bank will ask you to pay capital towards your mortgage in order to bring it down again to a 75% loan to value. That's what a lot of landlords at a high leverage don't understand. If you're an accidental landlord, I think you should just leave the market. You've got stress and paperwork coming along. I think it's time to go. And if you've got an old, inefficient stock and it's going to cost you an absolute fortune to repair and improve, you're not going to last in this market. And if you're in this for the short term and the quick profits, don't bother. Yeah, being a landlord, yeah, absolutely, Karen. Being a landlord, this is the most important thing. Let me just point out, being a private landlord and having an income or having appreciation out of being a private landlord is a long-term game. It is not a get-rich-quick. The things that you see on TikTok and Facebook and all the rest of it are typically furus, in other words, fake gurus, who are trying to sell you courses based on one person in the 2 million landlord community. It actually made a huge killing in the market. One person. And that's what they try to portray, that everybody's doing it. They are not. Karen, who should review their position?
So there's a few different people that should be reviewing it, if you bear with me, because my eyesight is not that good. So when it comes to reviewing your position, a few different factors here. Bear with me. So moderate leverage. So assess the rate risk. Can't even
the rate risk, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
And that's probably, I mean, for landlords with good leverage, I would say most banks, if a commercial bank will loan to you or lend to you, they usually say we're wanting a 55% loan to value. So anything between 55, I think, and 75% loan to value, I think you really need to assess that risk, don't you?
You do, definitely. And another one as well is property upgrades. So retrofit costs, obviously your property upgrades are something you have to keep in mind throughout the whole process that you're doing this.
EPCs upgrades, eh? It's going to get pushed. I mean, we had it coming in, but it's now more coming to fruition. The EPC is going to be calculated differently, and potentially it might actually come in. You might end up having to pay anything from 5,000 to 20,000 just to upgrade your property to the right EPC rating.
Yeah, and this is in excess of all the general maintenance things that you're going to have to do as well, making sure your boiler's still fit and working, kitchens, bathrooms are all still functioning and modern enough that the tenant's been able to get the full use out of them. So, and then, as you say, you can have EPCs on top of that as well. So these are all things that you need to be factoring in. And going back to what we've touched on, rent increases are something that you need to consider to be able to accommodate your property upgrades.
And I think as well, probably mid-term exit plans, if anybody's thinking about timing strategies and all the rest of it, you'll never be able to time this market, I'll be honest with you. And all the years I've done, I've been probably really fortunate, I would say, to just time it at the right time. I don't know how, I don't know why, I don't know how it happened, but I was always managed to buy just before the boom happened. I always managed to sell just before the crash came along. And I don't know why, I don't know how, and it wasn't timing or anything like that. It was just sheer luck. It just so happened at that time, and there was nothing else in it. And anybody that says they can time the housing market is talking absolute rubbish. There is no rhyme or reason how the housing market works. There's no cyclical every 15 to 20 years and stuff like that. There's a correction, because that has not happened so far in the last 50 years of the market. There's no clear evidence to suggest that there's any trends that happen. It's just happens because of consumer sentiment and probably the planets. I mean, when you say the planets align, sometimes you say it's all in sync, but sometimes the planets align for the wrong reasons, and then that's when that happens. What do you think? Do you think people should review their position on process and compliance as well then?
Definitely. I mean, your compliance for a property, I mean, safety certificates alone, you're having to keep up to date with your compliance there for them. Your electrical one, your EICR, is going to be your most expensive one realistically until the EPCs come into effect, because your electrics are something, it's every 5 years. Again, regulations change within that. Different types of fuse boards are needed, wiring. So these are usually, your EICR is usually the most expensive one. So again, review that ahead of time so your finances are in place for it. Gas safety certificates every year, so you know what's coming with them, you know what to expect, but definitely making sure your compliance is kept up to date. And even things like your landlord registration, that is something you have to keep up to date. Make sure your payments are up to date for it as well. It's not a significant cost there to make sure you are a registered landlord, but you do have to keep up to date with it.
And you better make sure you're up to date with your compliance, because I'll tell you what, when you do your landlord registration, they sometimes audit some of your properties, isn't that right?
They do indeed. So they may ask you for a copy of all your property safety certificates. So making sure you have them all is key.
Yeah, definitely. So this is who should double down. If you're in this market right now and you want to do it, you should double down if you've got a low leverage and cash reserves, strong reserves, because you know you can weather any storm that comes up. If your loan to value is like something like 55% or less in terms of the lending that you get, if you've bought outright, you've got no mortgage, then you should definitely possibly consider doubling down, because you will probably more than likely have strong cash reserves. If you've got a quality property and it's well maintained at this point in time, I think you've probably got nothing to worry about. And if you focus on long-term yields and you're not in it for the get rich quick that most of these furus actually peddle on Instagram and on TikTok and Facebook, then you definitely should be considering doubling down. I think the most important thing in doubling down, though, is the professional management. It's definitely somebody with experienced the operations, experienced at compliant, and experienced overall in managing a property. I think the days have gone from having if you're a single unit landlord, or if it's probably not worth your effort anymore. You could pay a letting agent to do it 80 quid or something like that every single month. You get a deduction against your value, and I think that's what you should do. If you are under Section 24 and you're a sole owner, it's maybe time to incorporate. because you don't know what's coming on the horizon. And I have a sneaky suspicion that tax credit at some point from 20% might actually be reduced if you're a single unit owner and you've got a mortgage on it. Because it's definitely something that's going to put you under pressure later on for your cash reserves. Definitely. If you're a low rate taxpayer, then you're probably all right, because that's what it is. But what happens if they cut that tax credit? What happens if they do away with it completely? Can you weather a storm? Can you exit the market? You're in a position where you would have to exit the market at the housing market at that point in time. What if the market is down in terms of house sales? What if houses aren't selling that well? What if there's been a correction as well? That's the things you've got to think about. So definitely, I think there's a golden opportunity there to reflect on this and say, there's where you should really seriously consider exiting. There's where you should review your position, and definitely there's the opportunities where you should double down.
Yeah, some good points in there. And as we say, it is definitely the long game. It's not a quick fix, quick bank account. That's making sure that you're doing this properly and sensibly, and making sure you're adhering to all the right legislation and paperwork and compliance and everything that goes along with it.
I don't think it ever has been, Karen. I've always said that being a private landlord is a long game, investing in property. It's never been a get-rich-quick approach. And it's just the one or two you see on TikTok and Facebook and social media that actually make it think that everybody's making a fortune, and they are not. I've just demonstrated it clearly there, where my rents, it's just the way it's happened, are still 35% below inflation. Had I started increasing them by inflation from the point that I actually rented them. So increasing the rent every single time inflation went up, if I increased the rent up to that point, I would have 35% more rent than I had today as a result of that. And that's a lot of landlords are like that as well. So they're not charging huge amounts of rent. It's just headlines to sensationalise the news. Final words, and we'll finish off there, Karen.
Be in it for the long game, and paperwork is key. Making sure you're being smart and everything is done by the book is key for being a landlord. Perfect. And getting a managing agent is so much less hassle.
I think as well. I mean, I've done both, and I'll tell you what: if you've got a well-paying job and you're in a professional environment, and you can make more money per hour or whatever you're doing, or you don't need the hassle because you don't want the phone calls at 6 o'clock at night and at weekends and stuff like that, then it definitely pays to have a professional managing agent to do it for you, because then you don't have the hassle anymore. You give them autonomy to do it. Today's regular landscape leaves no room for errors. We'd love to help you stay or become a successful landlord while keeping your litigation risk in check, because it is coming, especially with these new housing laws coming in 2026. You're in trouble if you're not in check. Okay? So if you need to get in touch with us, just give us a message on this post, or you could contact us on all the usual avenues and numbers that are available. Till next time, guys, thanks very much for tuning in, and I hope you've got a lot of insight out into that. And thanks very much for coming on, Karen. Been a great insight into this.
Yep, definitely some good points to take away.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.